It's coming to a theater near you. We're going to see it here. We're going to see your friends' children putting on the green headbands, joining Hamas, and trying to blow up synagogues, churches, libraries, universities. It's happening because Hamas is being allowed to win by CNN, by the New York Times, and by other media.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and its impact on world Jewry with a conversation with legal scholar, lawyer, and author Alan Dershowitz. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can find us on Telegram. You can see the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content there by subscribing. And now to today's program. One question dominates the conversation among American Jews in the wake of the October 7th atrocities committed by Hamas against innocent Israelis. How did antisemitism go mainstream? The speed with which the mainstream corporate media flipped the narrative from the greatest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust by a bloodthirsty Islamist terrorist group to one about a disproportionate Israeli response was dizzying. The same was true of the seeming surge in support for the idea that animate Hamas, the elimination of Israel, on the streets of American cities and especially on college campuses. But the instances of horrifying incidents in which Jews have been threatened, intimidated, and silenced in various venues are starting to pile up. The students rioting in a New York City high school targeting a Jewish teacher for supporting Israel is just one example. Just as troubling and infuriating is the willingness on the part of so much of enlightened opinion in the mainstream media to treat Israeli efforts to destroy a terrorist movement as morally equivalent to terrorism, and to treat Palestinian terrorists, unjustly released as part of the awful bargain brokered in part by President Joe Biden to gain the release of Israelis held hostage by the terrorists, as somehow the moral equals of kidnapping victims. Also infuriating is that even those who say they support Israeli security and the goal of eliminating terrorism is their belief that Israel must still be stopped from seeking to actually achieve that objective. It all adds up to a situation that is shocking to American Jews who thought right-wing lunatics with guns or a tiny number of neo-Nazis extremists with tiki torches were the main threat to their security. They are now realizing they live in a country where such people, however awful, aren't nearly as dangerous to their ability to live in America in 2023 as left-wingers who believe that Israel and Jews are white privileged oppressors. They must join those calling for more Jewish victims and the destruction of the one Jewish state on the planet to remain in sync with fashionable opinion. And far from the hostage negotiations helping to undermine these false narratives, it seems as if the situation is only getting worse, with support for more pauses and ceasefires only growing, that will effectively allow Hamas to get away with mass murder and to treat the Israeli campaign against them as illegitimate. Serious people state that anti-Semitism won't be tolerated, and yet it is tolerated and even encouraged, so long as support for a genocidal war against Israel and against Israel's right to self-defense is mainstreamed. The only real answer to this challenge is a more assertive defense of Jewish rights and a willingness to confront the toxic left-wing ideologies behind those mainstreaming hate against Jews. Mere opposition to anti-Semitism without a full-throated defense of Israel, an indictment of those seeking its destruction, is meaningless. But the other important question facing both American Jews is whether the anti-Semites profit from the political consequences of this war against the Jewish state. The fate of not just the Democratic Party in the 2024 presidential election will hinge in no small measure on the answers to all of these questions. Joining us today to analyze the situation and to discuss how American Jews can fight back is someone who has been speaking up for Israel for decades. Alan Dershowitz is an emeritus professor of law at Harvard University Law School, where he taught for more than 50 years. His famous legal cases that he was part of, including the trials of Klaus von Bülow, O.J. Simpson, Mike Tyson, Jeffrey Epstein, and former President Donald Trump, are too numerous to list. The same is true for the many books he has written, including Reversal of Fortune, Chutzpah, The Case for Israel, Defending Israel, The Story of My Relationship with My Most Challenging Client, Guilt by Accusation, The Challenge of Proving Innocence in the Age of Me Too, Cancel Culture, The Latest Attack on Free Speech and Due Process, The Case Against the New Censorship, Protecting Free Speech from Big Tech Progressives and Universities, as well as a new book coming out next month, War Against the Jews, How to End Hamas Barbarism. Alan Dershowitz, welcome back to Top Story.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Professor Dershowitz, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. You are someone who has been vocal in speaking about the war on Israel and the ideas of those who seek its destruction and criticize it unfairly over the decades. But are even you surprised by the speed with which much of the mainstream media and, shall we say, fashionable opinion flipped the narrative from one about the atrocities of October 7th to supposed Israeli, disproportionate attacks, and the surge in anti-Semitism, which we've seen on the streets of our cities and especially on campuses? Are you shocked by it? I think a lot of American Jews are, but you've been following this for a long time.
I have to be immodest about this. I wasn't at all shocked. As early as the late 1980s, certainly the early 1990s, I predicted this. I wrote about what I called the CNN or the dead baby strategy that Hamas has used. I wrote a whole book about it. And it's just a repetition of the strategy. Hamas kills a lot of Jews, knows that Israel has to respond by going after its rockets, its tunnels, and its commanders. They hide those military items among civilians, knowing that there'll be some babies killed. They're ready with the TV cameras, and they show the dead babies to CNN and the New York Times that willingly collaborates with Hamas to allow them to carry out their CNN strategy. And then it's just wash, rinse, repeat. Michael Finnegan, begin again. It's the same thing over and over again, except that October 7th was much worse in that it involved killings not only by Hamas terrorists, but by ordinary Gaza civilians, so-called civilians, came across the open fences and murdered and raped and pillaged and robbed and did all the things that every Israeli knew Hamas would do if they ever got access to Israelis. The surprise in that respect wasn't October 7th, it was October 6th. That is a lack of preparation by the Israeli army and Israeli intelligence. And October 8th, as you pointed out, the reaction didn't surprise me. The fact that the reaction has been acceptable. Take, for example, an organization like the National Lawyers Guild. It's a prominent organization, thousands of members. They have branches at virtually every American university. And the day after, on October 8th, before Israel sent a single soldier into Gaza, they justified the attack, saying it was an entirely appropriate military attack. They applauded it. And the same thing was true of 33 groups at Harvard University. That didn't surprise me because I know the National Lawyers Guild is an old-line Communist Front organization. became a Hamas front organization. What did surprise me is some of the young kids, the useful idiots who went along. They reminded me a little bit of Hitler's Youth. A lot of the people who joined Hitler Youth at the University of Munich and the University of Berlin didn't know that it would end up in the kind of genocide that it ended up in. But everybody was joining Hitler's Youth. All the good people were joining Hitler's Youth. And now the people at Vassar and at Harvard and at Princeton, hey, it's the right thing to do. Let's go against Israel, that colonialist Western pro-American state. And the result has been to create a deep partisan divide over Israel, to expose extremists. And remember, a lot of these demonstrations are conducted by the Socialist Party and by people who declare themselves to be communists, people who are hard anti-American, hard left, and they get people to go along with them. And that's why we have the illusion that Israel is losing the public relations war. I think it's an illusion because the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of political figures in America, even a majority, I won't say vast, a majority of academics support Israel, not necessarily the Netanyahu government, not necessarily the occupation, but support Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Well, I guess that raises the question of how did, these really toxic ideologies which falsely claim Israel to be a colonialist, white privileged state, which is insane on so many levels, how did that gain so much influence on our, some of us have been writing about it for a long time and commenting, and certainly you have very prominently, but it really has taken hold, not merely, of some sociology departments, but it is mainstream opinion even, in the op-ed page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. It is more than merely fashionable opinion. It is the progressives, so-called. You're right. Most Americans have no interest in this kind of thinking because they rightly see it as anti-American too. But it has taken hold of our educational system. And it's churning out a new generation of people who are, as you say, sort of neo-fascist, Hitler Youth.
Well, there are two reasons for it, and they both occurred one of them occurred over the last couple of decades, and the other one occurred over the last decade. The most pernicious and dangerous is the bureaucracy, the billion-dollar bureaucracy of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Every major university today has spent millions of dollars hiring these fascists who want to make sure there's no free speech, and diversity is only skin color, and equity is the opposite of equality, and inclusion excludes Jews and Asians. And it's become a very important part of university administration. They cost more. I suspect that the diversity department costs more for Harvard than the philosophy department. It's become a central part of the institution, and that's number one. And that's easy because you can get rid of that. That you can get rid of, and I think most Americans would agree we should get rid of that. That there's no room on university campuses for these bureaucracies. They have been the center of the anti-Semitism. Virtually all of the DEI programs have ended up being anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and anti-American. The harder one is this, and this is controversial. I have proposed for years that there be no ethnic studies departments at all. No black studies departments, no gay studies departments, no women's studies departments, no Asian studies departments, and here I'm going to be controversial, no Jewish studies departments. The Jewish studies departments have been among the worst. Why? Well, first of all, who gets to be a professor of Jewish studies in Europe and in America? Usually it's failed Israeli academics, people who aren't smart enough or good enough to get jobs at Tel Aviv or Hebrew University. And so they come and they throw themselves at these universities that know nothing about Jewish studies. And they say, I want a job. And the university says, why should we hire you? And the answer is because I'm a talking dog. What do you mean you're a talking dog? I'm an Israeli who hates Israel. oh, you're hired. And these departments have become filled with anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli, third-rate academics. The same thing is true, by the way, of Holocaust studies. Many of the Holocaust studies departments at Brown University, at Dartmouth University, have been loaded with anti-Zionist and anti-Israel propagandists. And the students follow them. Students today take ethnic studies. It's easy. If you're black and you take black studies, you know you're going to get a good grade. If you're a woman and you take a women's studies program, particularly, they say these programs are critical race theory. No, they're uncritical race theory. They're cheering squads for the particular ethnic group. They destroy education. They destroy intellectual diversity, and they promote anti-Semitism. So it's a dream to get rid of these departments, but it's a nightmare to have them. So I think that both the DEI and the ethnic studies programs have been the source of much of the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which parades as legitimate, but scratch it a little bit, and it's anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. And, I think anybody who studied the way Middle East studies and now Israel studies, in addition to Jewish studies, have become, just as you say, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist bastions. I want to push back a little bit on you on one thing you say. You're absolutely right about how DEI, the whole woke catechism, is at the heart of this problem. But yet, and I think you're also right to say that most Americans don't support the idea, don't support equity rather than equality, and inclusion, meaning only some groups but not others. But yet, DEI isn't so easily gotten rid of because it's been imposed everywhere. It's in corporations. It's even in the government now. That was one of the Biden administration's first acts, was to sort of create a DEI executive order. And now, I think at the beginning of the last year, every government agency and department has to have its own DEI plan and appoint their own DEI woke commissar to do this. I mean, that's really hard to get rid of when it's that widespread, isn't it?
Got rid of it during McCarthyism. McCarthyism had the same thing. You had to swear allegiance to certain dogmas and ideologies, and we got rid of it at a high cost. But this is the new McCarthyism. People at some places actually have to take an oath and have to support. I've been giving legal advice to a number of academics who refuse to sign on, and I tell them not to sign on. They have no obligation. I wouldn't sign a DEI pledge. I don't agree with it. So why would I ever dream of signing it? Just like I wouldn't sign an anti-Zionist a pledge. Or, by the way, I wouldn't sign a pro-Zionist pledge either. I don't sign pledges. In 50 years of teaching at Harvard, I never expressed a private, personal, political view in the classroom. My job has always been to teach students how to think, not what to think. But DEI is exactly the opposite. And these ethnic studies programs are exactly the opposite. They're propaganda mills. They're designed to teach students what to think, tell them what to think. I know, I've spoken to some of these students. They repeat by rote the propaganda that the departments spew out. And now you have another policy. Departments vote on things like boycott, divestiture, inclusion, and boycotting Israel. So, for example, without any undue modesty, I'm probably the most prominent graduate of the Brooklyn College Political Science Department. I went there, I majored, I was, all A's and all of that. They refused to invite me back. They will not allow me to speak against boycotting Israel. They said, well, we've already had a speaker, Norman Finkelstein. Why do we need another speaker like you? The faculty at New York City College, New York City University Law School voted unanimously, not a single dissent, unanimously to boycott only Israel, not Cuba, not Iran, not China, not any other country, but Israel. And then they had speakers at their graduation that were blatantly anti-Semitic. Can you imagine being a student that's at fifth-grade law school, trying to get a decent education? You're not going to get one there no matter what. But and bucking against teachers and being graded by teachers who have already publicly committed that they think the country you support is the only one that should be boycotted. It's an absolute disgrace. And if the City University of New York Law School wants to do it, let them be a private university. Let them get funded by the National Lawyers Guild and by the Socialists of America. But I don't see why those of us who pay taxes should be paying taxes for this kind of propaganda and for a fifth-rate law school. This is now common. These loyalty oaths that people like me and you objected to back in the day, but today they're common on colleges and in other institutions as well.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. Sort of getting rid of it, I think in the government and in corporations is a political question. But let's talk just for a minute, drill down a little bit on, the academy.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It may be a legal question too. I know there are some lawsuits pending against aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I support those lawsuits, and I hope others will support those lawsuits. Remember, we live under a system of law and judicial review, and there are certain things that universities and colleges just cannot get away with under the First Amendment. So I want to encourage people to bring those lawsuits and to support those lawsuits when they're brought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say just parenthetically, that applies across the board to some of the ethnic studies, woke ethnic studies initiatives, especially in California. I know a group like the Deborah, is trying to sue, to do that, just as you say. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the universities and the academy. Sort of the long march of the progressives have, as you say, taken over so many institutions, not just fifth-rate law schools, as you say, but, some of the most prominent ones. Elite, Ivy League schools, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton. The question arises, how do we turn such huge institutions and get them back to sanity when they have funding? They have enormous, sources of funds, many of which are coming from foundations that support just these toxic ideas. There's a debate now as to whether they're salvageable at all, and that, perhaps we need to do somehow. And I don't, it's not easy to replace them, or at least provide some alternatives, because it's not clear, at least to me, how we do bring these institutions back to sanity.
Okay, I think I get calls all the time from parents of high school students. We don't want to send our kids to Harvard. Where should we go? And, there's a handful of universities that have rejected all of this. So far, none of them have emerged as, first-rate universities, and everybody wants to do what's good for their children, and they think Harvard is good for their children. But let me tell you, the students vote with their feet. They don't go to Harvard. They get admitted to Harvard, but they don't go to Harvard. They take STEM. They take science, technology, engineering, and math. They don't go near the ethnic studies departments. They don't go near political science. They don't go near history. They stay away from everything but analytic philosophy. They vote with their feet. So, Harvard is not a great university. Harvard is a university that has several great departments and several mediocre and worse departments that rely on the name of Harvard to give them the status as being part of a great university. And so one of the things to do is not to tell your children, first of all, children don't always listen, but not to tell your children to refuse to apply to Harvard and Yale, but to encourage them to take courses that don't include this kind of propaganda. And I always tell parents, it depends on who your kid is. If you have a kid like me, hey, send them into the belly of the beast. There's nothing better than a good fight. But if you have a kid who's going to be intimidated, no, you can't send them to Harvard or Yale. You have to send them maybe to the University of Chicago. That's a possible place, although even there, there's a faculty member at the law school who's a blatant anti-Semite, and other places as well. There's no school that's totally immune from this propagandistic approach that has been imposed on it by woke. And of course, It was so interesting because Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, brilliantly says, La kol saman, to everything there is a season. And there was a season. When I came to Harvard in 1964, it was rampant with old-fashioned anti-Semitism. You couldn't be the president of the university. You couldn't be a dean. You couldn't get into some of the clubs. You couldn't get a job. Law firms recruited at Harvard that overtly discriminated. And then I'm not saying it's because I went there or Ruth Weiss went there or others, and Bob Nozick, Steve Pinker, but there was a golden age, which roughly was parallel to the time I was there, 50 years starting in 1964, maybe until a little slightly before that. And a lot of the presidents of universities were Jewish. Harvard had a Jewish president. Yale still has a Jewish president. In fact, many of the Ivy League schools have Jewish presidents. Today, these presidents have been gently pushed out and replaced by woke presidents who represent the kind of diversity that DEI establishes. And so you have the administrators being somewhat sympathetic, but it's not that they're sympathetic. As one of my friends who was the president of a major university but retired once said, the one qualification that does not exist for being the president of a university or the dean of a university is courage. These people do not stand up. They just, look at the president of Harvard. She issued like 5 separate letters after October 7th, each one seeming to be generated by the people who protested, each one trying to, strike the appropriate balance. I love when schools say, oh, we have 2 problems in our school. We have a problem of anti-Semitism and a problem of Islamophobia. No, you don't. You have a problem of anti-Semitism. You do not have a problem of Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism is systemic through the university, through the DEI and ethnic studies program. It's systemic. Whereas if you get an occasional anti-Muslim statement by a student, it's not systemic. Pro-Islam, pro-African-American, pro-gay, those are systemic in the university. And so this business of trying to create equality between the concerns about anti-Semitism, which are real, and the concerns about anti-Muslim attitudes, which are way exaggerated, reflects this kind of an attempt by university administrators to strike an appropriate balance that will be satisfactory to its board and to its contributors. It's not working. We're seeing through it.
Yeah, well, it paints a pretty dismal picture. Let's switch for a moment now to the events on the ground that are generating, a lot of this anti-Semitism. And one thing, we're speaking now as the hostage exchanges, whereby not hostage exchange, the hostages are being released in exchange for an Israeli ceasefire and release of Palestinian terrorists. Are you concerned? I mean, obviously, I would say, it would have been almost impossible for Prime Minister Netanyahu to have refused an opportunity to free some of these hostages, the children, the women, any of them, if there was a way to free them. And that's become the focus of much of the sympathy for Israel. But are you concerned about how the implications of this, the consequence of terrorists profiting from their crime, and whether this will, ultimately derail Israel's goal, which is supported at least in principle by President Biden, of eliminating Hamas?
Yeah. Look, on October 7th, it was Shabbos, and I generally have a policy of not working on Shabbos. I violated my policy, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I had already written about 20 pages of my new book, which just literally is coming out now as we speak, War Against the Jews, How to End Hamas's Barbarism. I finished writing it in 6 weeks. I called my publisher that Saturday and I said, look, I have to write a book about this. I was in the middle of another book. Can I put that on hold? And they said, look, if you can get it to us in 30 days. And I said, I'll do it. And I dropped everything and I got it to them in 30 days and they published it only a couple of weeks later. And in it, I go through in great detail the decision-making process when you have hostages that are taken. As you may know, years ago, both Netanyahu and I wrote books about terrorism. And in both of our books, mine was called Why Terrorism Works. In both of my books, we urge not negotiating with terrorists, knowing that hostages will die as the result. But, it's like the alleged Winston Churchill decision. People dispute whether this actually occurred, but was told that Coventry would be bombed. But if he revealed that fact, the Germans would know that the British had broken the Enigma code. And so Churchill allowed hundreds of people to die in order to prevent Germany from knowing that the code had been broken. And those kinds of tragic choices have to be made all the time. My preference would have been for Israel and the United States never, ever to negotiate with terrorists, and to know that terrorists, once they're caught, are likely to end up dead. It's very hard to do, and particularly hard to do when there are 220 of them, and when you're an elected official in a democracy. It's much easier to do if you're a tyrant. But if the parents of the children and the relatives come to you with tears in their eyes, and you're the prime minister, you can't refuse to see them, and you can't refuse to give in. So Hamas put Israel to a horrible, tragic choice, and Israel did what any democracy would do. But it's not going to be, it's going to encourage more hostage taking. And by the way, I think it's coming to America. I think we're going to see hostages taken in America. We're already seeing that some of these Hitler Youth from the extreme left are now engaged in violence and terrorism. There was an incident in I think it was New Hampshire, Vermont, where an Israeli company was sacked and damaged. We're going to see terrorism come to the United States because Hamas has been successful in changing the dynamic as a result of their terrorism. And these kids who want to overthrow America, want to overthrow capitalism, want to overthrow so-called colonialism, want to overthrow the West, and they think that anything is justifiable. The National Lawyers Guild said that in their paper. Anything goes. There are no limitations. You're going to see young people joining Hamas, young Americans, blue-eyed, blonde hair, all Americans, apple pie, doing what they did in the 1970s. People forget. We have such short memories. In the 1970s, they tried to blow up the University of Wisconsin. They tried to blow up Fort Dix. Remember the 12th Street explosions. These were people, some of whom were friends with Barack Obama later on in life. These were people who were prepared to kill innocent people in order to achieve their revolutionary goals. It's coming to a theater near you. We're going to see it here. We're going to see your friends' children putting on the green headbands, joining Hamas, and trying to blow up synagogues, churches, libraries, universities. It's happening because Hamas is being allowed to win by CNN, by the New York Times, and by other media. That's the thesis of my book, War Against the Jews, that Hamas is going to be allowed to win again if we don't change that dynamic. We haven't done it in the past, and there's no reason to think we'll do it again. The United States is now trying to pressure Israel to ease up. You watch on television Fareed Zakaria. That's all he talks about, is how we have to impose restrictions on Israel. You get senators now, including Jewish senators and congressmen, calling for unilateral ceasefire originally. Now they're coupling it with return of the hostages. But if this is allowed to happen, if Hamas prevails and wins this based on their own horrors of October 7th, it's coming to a theater near you. I guarantee it.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. And I think we're already seeing sort of spontaneous evidence of this. With or without the green headbands, there was an incident in a New York City high school, Hillcrest High School, where a Jewish teacher who had on her social media indicated that she had attended the march in Washington and expressed support for Israel. Students rioted, shut down the school. She was forced to hide in a locked office for hours. And now, of course, people are saying, well, it's unacceptable, but what are they doing about it? What kind of punishments will be dealt out? How will they address the root problems? And yet, you're right. Once the example of successful terrorism, is sort of vindicated, it only inspires more such crimes.
Yeah, and also the media selectively decides to publish the race or the ethnicity of the people or the schools in which this occurs. It crosses lines. We're now seeing, obviously, people of Palestinian background, many, too many African Americans who seem to be going along with this, but we're also seeing white Protestants and some Jews going along with this as well. I mean, it's no surprise that Jews support some of this. People forget that Gertrude Stein, a Jew, and her girlfriend were complicitous with the Gestapo. She nominated Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize. Norman Finkelstein. There are so many Jews who are essentially capos.
All organizations full of them, like Jewish Voices for Peace, and If Not Now.
Voice for Peace is not Jewish. That's right. It's weird. You have to understand, Jewish Voice for Peace has nothing to do with Jewish. I don't even know if a majority of its members are Jewish. A lot of them are not. I know that. I've met some of them. They use the word Jewish so that CNN will say, as they do, oh, look at how many Jews. The Jews who are protesting are Neturei Karta, which is this crazy, rabid, fanatical group. One of my distant cousins is in it, that is religiously anti-Zionist. Okay, I can understand that. But supporting Iran, supporting Hamas, they're doing that now. There are nutty Jews, of course. And then there's Jewish Voice for Peace, which is not Jewish. Thank God it has no voice. It acts mostly through physical actions, and it's not in favor of peace. There are left-wing, progressive, hard woke Jews that put their hard progressive values over their Jewish heritage and background. That's a small group as well. But the vast majority of Jews in America today and around the world support Israel, even though many don't support the policies of this particular government. As I don't support Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the extreme right wing of the current government. I wish this became an opportunity for a more national unity government, which would exclude the extremists. You could criticize Israeli policies, but I obviously strongly believe in Israel's right to exist as an independent nation state of the Jewish people and to defend itself by all reasonable means. Let me be very clear as well. Israel is not guilty of any war crimes. One has to look at these claims. The New York Times had a story just the other day about how Israel killed more civilians than any country in the 20th century. It was a false story. It deserves to be condemned. Hamas figures are not to be believed, number one, the 12,000. Number two, Hamas doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. So theoretically, you could have 11,000 of them being combatants, and it would still be 12,000 people killed. They don't distinguish between people being killed who were killed by Islamic Jihad or Hamas rockets that just misfire. Between 15 to 20% of those rockets misfire and land there. They call children anybody who's under 18, which can mean 17-year-old suicide bombers, 17, 16-year-old people who come with rifles. People who were involved in October 7th were children. So, the Times story was outrageous. Then they say Israel killed more civilians than in Ukraine. Think about that for a second. Nobody in Ukraine is using human shields. Nobody in Ukraine is hiding Ukrainian assets, military assets, among civilians. Every civilian who's killed in Ukraine or in Russia is a civilian that's been targeted explicitly. How you can compare that to what's going on in Gaza, where Hamas willfully, deliberately, and publicly acknowledges that it uses human shields as shaheeds? How do you allow a newspaper of record? How does the editor of the New York Times justify allowing, if a student turned in a paper with the kind of statistical analysis misused by the New York Times, I would flunk that student. And in 50 years of teaching at Harvard, I think I flunked 3 students, but I would flunk a student who turned in that paper about civilian casualties in Gaza without making the distinctions, any of the distinctions that we've been talking about. They buried somewhere in the middle of the article the statement that Hamas doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants, but then they fail to distinguish, for example, the people who came over on October 7th were not combatants, they were civilians. They were not Hamas members, but they came over as criminals and they murdered and raped. Are they to be classified as civilians if Israel kills some of them? I hope Israel kills some of the people who came over as civilians and committed these kinds of murders and rapes. I sure hope they did, but the Times couldn't care less about who it is. And even if you're a civilian, are any of us going to shed a tear for the father who got a phone call from his son? Hey, Daddy, I just killed 10 Jews with my bare hands. And the father says, oh, great, Allah Akbar, I wish you had killed more. Yeah, he's a civilian, and he shouldn't be killed, and it's illegal to kill him. But if he dies collaterally, is anybody going to shed a tear? I am not going to shed a tear. For me, he's like the Nazi I represented, who then walks across the street and gets hit by a bus. Cheers for that. Cheers for whatever this guy got, he deserved. And the same thing is true of many, not all, not most, but many of the adults in Gaza who strongly supported, lent their homes out, allowed rockets to be sent out, allowed the terrorists to hide, allowed their homes to be used for tunnels. These are civilians, but they're not people who should be counted as tragic deaths. These are people who had it coming in many, many ways. Again, not the children, not the babies, not the innocent people, not some of the elderly. I'm 85 years old, and believe me, I'd be held responsible if I did anything of the kind that was done on October 7th. So let's be very careful about using terms like civilians and combatants. There is a continuum, and many of the people who have been killed fall on the combatant side of the continuum.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into the politics, but before we, and the consequences of what's going on, but before we do, I want to get back to the Academy on one point. You've been outspoken about the need to hold those who engage in open anti-Semitism, support for Hamas terrorism, for the genocide of Jews, whether it's students or professors, and that they should be held up for opprobrium, and that no law firm should hire someone who engages in open anti-Semitism. Indeed, the point I've made is that, you know, if they had engaged in support for lynching of African Americans, what law firm would hire someone who did that? And yet you've gotten a lot of pushback within the academy, within the legal profession. I saw there was an article in the New York Law Journal denouncing you for this. Why are these people wrong? Why isn't this a free speech case?
Well, of course it is. And the woman who attacked me in the New York Law Journal is an active member of the National Lawyers Guild, and she hid that. She unethically failed to disclose her active role in the National Lawyers Guild. And my article was an attack on the National Lawyers Guild. And she writes, as a Hofstra professor of ethics, that I was wrong. Look, I am very proud of the fact that I believe the First Amendment, the marketplace of ideas, generally requires the disclosure of the names and the backgrounds of people who have made arguments so they can be answered on the merits. You know, we all understand the argument ad hominem. You don't judge ideas by who made them. But of course we judge ideas by who made them. If you're an active member of the Communist Party, an active member of the Fascist Party, if you're a member of the PLO or a member of Hamas, hey, I judge your argument a little differently than if you're a priest or a minister or a rabbi. So I want to know who you are, number one. Number two, I didn't say the law firm shouldn't hire them. I said the law firms should disclose, if they do hire any of these Hamas supporters, the law firms should disclose to the clients the fact that they are assigning somebody who believes in lynching blacks or raping women or beheading Jews. And then if the client wants it, and some of the Lawyers Guild clients will say, oh, great, that's a qualification for being my lawyer, that's fine. But don't assign to a Jewish client who believes in raping Jewish women, and don't assign to a black client a man who believes in lynching blacks. All I'm calling for is full disclosure. Of course I'm criticized, and I'll continue to be criticized, and I'll be criticized on the way to my grave. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. and that's who I will continue to be as long as the good Lord gives me the energy to fight back and to answer falsehoods, not with censorship, but with truth.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, their, stance on the war. Now, you're a proud Democrat. You speak openly about who you vote for. And you have to be happy with President Biden for his vocal support for Israel, his commitment to the war against Hamas. Are you concerned about the direction the administration is going in and the pressure that it's getting from the left wing, the sort of intersectional wing of the Democrats, who, as you rightly point out, are not the majority, but they seem to have disproportionate pull, certainly within this administration, or at least they have the ability to scare the people at the top there?
No, I'm much more scared of Jamie Raskin than I am of Ilhan Omar, because he's a former student of mine, nice guy, everybody likes him. And deep in his heart, he's a progressive, woke leftist, and he's trying to strike an appropriate balance. But, he uses his Jewishness and his constituency in Maryland to be able to, for example, he called for, as far as I remember, unilateral ceasefire, which means a victory for Hamas and a defeat for Israel. So I'm worried that the woke squad, which really doesn't have a lot of influence on the administration, certainly in the White House, does have influence on senators and members of Congress, particularly Jewish members. There are a number of Jewish members of Congress who use their Jewishness as a way of saying, see, on the one hand, on the other hand, this is difficult. We want to say Sanders is the worst, of course. Not very many people could make me Republicans, but Sanders could. If he were nominated for president by the Democrats, I would vote Republican, depending on who the nominee is, of course. But so I worry a lot about the Democratic Party. I'm remaining a Democrat. By the way, I'm not a Democrat in the sense I don't have a card. I vote for Republicans when the Republican's the better candidate. I supported Bill Weld for governor of Massachusetts and, a handful of other Republicans over my career. But I tend to vote Democrat, like my father and mother and grandmother and grandfather did for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, deeply flawed as he was on the Holocaust and other issues. But I worry about the direction. I'll remain a supporter of Democrats for several reasons. One, I support their agenda. I support gay rights. I support women's rights. I support reasonable gun control, separation of church and state, reasonable climate control, and the Democrats are better on that than the Republicans. But I am critical of some of the policies on the Middle East, obviously. I don't like the fact that President Biden talked about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the same breath. That was just pandering. On the other hand, I think his support has been strong. I would like it to be stronger, but I'll settle for it to be what it is, as long as it doesn't move away from Israel as the result of pressure, not from I'm not worried about the wokes, but pressure from the Jamie Raskins.
Right. Well, I think a lot of the analysis about what's going on in American politics vis-a-vis Israel has been about a generational divide. We've already spoken about the way young people have been indoctrinated by this, woke catechism and how that's influenced them to falsely view Israel as the oppressor. But clearly within the sort of the structure of the Democratic Party right now, if one of the things that I really thought was worth noting were the revolts, these letters from staffers throughout various departments, the State Department, but other departments as well, lower level people, and the people who work for congressmen, including some stalwart pro-Israel people. It's like these are the sort of the future congressmen, the future diplomats, the future secretaries of state in Democratic administrations. And they seem to be wholeheartedly against Israel and supporting unilateral ceasefire and, buying into a lot of the myths about Israel. Is that the future of the Democratic Party? Because that's what the progressives claim. And it seems to be what the polls are showing as well.
It could be. And it would be a terrible thing if Israel became a partisan issue. And it may. and in which case I will support Israel over these radical progressives. And I do think that there are a lot of young, ignorant people who just go with the flow. If it's left, it must be right. That's a terrible, terrible thing for people to say. And by the way, those who say, and there have been a few members of Congress who said, well, we don't judge our staff members by what they say outside the office. Bullshit. Of course they. If somebody said that blacks should be lynched or women would be raped, they'd be fired in a second. So they are very selective in which kinds of things they will use to dismiss somebody. I believe that anybody who supports Hamas has no role. Remember, it's a crime. It's a federal crime to provide material support to a designated terrorist organization. Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. Just by supporting them, you can't be put in jail. But I think supporting Hamas, supporting a terrorist organization, is a fireable offense. And it would be perfectly legitimate to do that. And that's not McCarthyism. There's a big difference between supporting the Palestinian side or supporting, the Ukrainians or the Russians, and supporting a group that advocates the death of Jews, the end of the nation state of the Jewish people, and that supports the kinds of horrendous things we saw occurring. Again, you have to apply the shoe on the other foot test. If there were a radical, for example, what happened in, was it Oklahoma City back 100 years ago when there were riots and people killed blacks, if somebody were to support that, of course they would be fired, and of course they would not be elected, and of course we would apply very, very tough measures to them. Whatever applies to them applies to Hamas. That's what I tell universities. Should we ban advocacy of Hamas? I said, would you ban advocacy of the Nazi Party? However you would treat Nazis, however you would treat the Ku Klux Klan, however you would treat supporters of raping women, that's the way you have to deal with supporters of Hamas. It has to be a single standard. And the schools, no school that I know of applies a single standard.
Right. I think that's very, very well said. Let me ask you one last question about sort of the future of this conflict. You have long been a supporter of the idea of a two-state solution as sort of the only rational way to end the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Where's the state of the two-state solution now? I would say, I wouldn't think that Israeli opinion, which is I think the majority of Israelis had given up on the peace process for a long time. This isn't, President Biden has said he wants the two-state solution to be revived once the guns stop firing. That seems to me, I think you believe in the tooth fairy if you think that's going to happen. But, is it even remotely possible? And what do you think of the consequences of advocating for it under these circumstances?
Well, I think of the alternatives. You think of somebody who is an extraordinarily dangerous person, Peter Beinart, who advocates two things. One, every Palestinian who ever had a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt or a grandmother or anybody who had anything to do with Israel, who ever had a cup of coffee in Tel Aviv, should be allowed to come back. And then that area should become a binational state, which would automatically become a majority Arab state, and the Arabs would then get access to Israel's nuclear arsenal, etc. I mean, if anybody takes Peter Beinart seriously, I have to tell you, there's a mental institution nearby that they should visit. But
the New York Times takes him seriously.
Yeah,
they publish him,
and he writes this dribble in the New York Times, and he never answers the question. If you're in favor of a two-state solution, what would you do with Israel's nuclear armaments? Would you turn it over to the Palestinians? And don't you think that if you had a binational state, we would have massacres like this every day? It would be a civil war in action. How about also having a one-state solution for Pakistan and India and some other countries? And how about a law of return for all the Nazis and the Germans who were kicked out of Sudetenland? Or for the Germans who were taken out of Kaliningrad? Why don't we have the right of return universally? So, I mean, the the absurdity of that argument. And then you get people like Mark Lamont Hill who say that it's colonialist to allow Israel to remain the way it is, but we have to bring back all the people again. The one-state solution is absurd and an invitation to genocide. What is the other alternative? Sometimes you have to not go for the best, you have to go for the least worst. I'm a criminal lawyer, and most of my clients over history have been guilty. And so my job is often not to get them the best. Sometimes I'm fortunate and I get them the best result. Mostly I get them the least worst. If I can get them 10 years instead of 20, if I can get them 20 instead of 30, if I can get them life instead of death, hey, those are great victories. So I'm used to incrementalism, and I'm used to selecting the least worst solution. And I think aspirationally, a two-state solution, a peaceful Palestinian state, as neighbors living next door, dominated by people who believe in a Palestinian democracy. It's a dream. But as Theodore Herzl said, if you dream it, it can happen. So I support the two-state solution as the least worst alternative, because I can't support any of the other solutions that have been put forward. But I don't think it's coming quickly.
Yeah, well, obviously not. Professor Dershowitz, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone should look out for your new book coming out very soon, The War Against the Jews, How to End Hamas Barbarism. I also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and tell us where you listen or watch the show and what you think of it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.